There comes a moment in almost every thinking person's life when a dangerous thought quietly forms. Most people aren't very smart. It usually arrives after a frustrating conversation, or during an election cycle, or while scrolling through an endless feed of confident opinions built on fragile facts. You look around and wonder how so many adults can function while believing things that collapse under 5 minutes of scrutiny. And then comes the second, even more dangerous thought. Maybe I'm one of the few who sees clearly. This book begins in that moment, not to confirm it, not to shame it, but to dissect it, because the truth is both more unsettling and more fascinating than the idea that most humans lack intelligence. What appears to be stupidity is often something far more structured, more predictable, and more universal, the architecture of the human mind itself. We are not primarily reasoning machines, we are survival machines, and our brains evolved to detect threats, preserve social bonds, conserve energy, and maintain identity. Accuracy was useful, but belonging was essential. Being right mattered less than staying alive. Over thousands of years, natural selection optimized us not for truth, but for cohesion, speed, and emotional security. The result? A species capable of landing probes on Mars and also forwarding misinformation with absolute confidence. A species that can decode the human genome and still lose arguments to its own biases. This book is not an attack on humanity, it is an investigation. We will explore why intelligent people defend weak ideas, why confidence so often exceeds competence, why do groups amplify error, why facts struggle against identity, why emotional reasoning feels like logic, and most importantly, why you are not exempt from any of it. Because the most dangerous cognitive bias is the belief that biases belong to other people. If you came here hoping to confirm that most humans are foolish, you may be disappointed. If you came here willing to examine the machinery of your own mind, you may never see people or yourself the same way again. Welcome to the Uncomfortable Mirror. Chapter 1: Cognitive Biases. Human beings like to imagine that they see the world clearly. We assume that our opinions are the result of careful reasoning, that our conclusions are guided by evidence, and that when we disagree with others, it is usually because they are misinformed. But the truth is more complicated. Every thought we have passes through a set of invisible mental filters known as cognitive biases. These biases are not signs of stupidity. In fact, they are the brain's attempt to be efficient. The human mind is constantly overwhelmed by information, news, conversations, memories, social signals, advertisements, and countless tiny decisions. If we analyzed every piece of information with perfect logic, we would barely function. So the brain cheats. It uses shortcuts. It fills in gaps. It simplifies complex realities into manageable stories. Most of the time, these shortcuts help us move quickly through the world. But sometimes they distort reality in ways that quietly shape our beliefs, our decisions, and even the direction of societies. One of the most powerful of these filters is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the mind's tendency to search for, remember, and interpret information in ways that support what we already believe. Once an idea settles in our mind, the brain begins acting less like a neutral scientist and more like a defense lawyer, selecting evidence that strengthens the case while ignoring evidence that weakens it. We rarely notice this happening. That is what makes it so powerful. Imagine a man named Daniel. Daniel is not unintelligent. He has a stable job, reads the news regularly, and considers himself well informed about the world. One evening, he reads an article online claiming that a particular economic policy is destroying small businesses. The article is dramatic. It contains statistics, interviews, and bold headlines. It also aligns with something Daniel has felt for a while, that the system is unfair. His brain registers something important in that moment: agreement. The agreement feels good. It creates a sense of clarity and validation. So Daniel shares the article with friends and continues reading similar sources. Over the next few weeks, something subtle happens. When Daniel sees articles that support the same narrative, He reads them carefully. He remembers their statistics. He shares them online. When he encounters articles that contradict the claim, he reacts differently. Perhaps the source seems biased. Maybe the author seems arrogant. Maybe the numbers feel suspicious. Without consciously deciding to do so, he dismisses the information more quickly. Months later, Daniel is completely convinced that the policy is disastrous. Yet if someone else reviewed the entire body of evidence, including the studies Daniel ignored, they might reach a more nuanced conclusion. Daniel is not lying. He is not intentionally ignoring facts. His brain is simply doing what human brains evolved to do, protecting a coherent story. Now imagine millions of Daniels. Each person is gathering evidence that supports their worldview. Each person is surrounded by friends, media outlets, and online communities that reinforce those same beliefs. The result is not merely disagreement, it is parallel realities. Groups become certain that they alone possess the truth while their opponents must be ignorant, dishonest, or irrational. Dialogue becomes difficult because both sides believe the evidence is overwhelmingly in their favor. In reality, both sides are often looking at different slices of information through different cognitive filters. Cognitive biases influence nearly every major domain of life. They shape political decisions, financial bubbles, medical misinformation, workplace conflicts, and social polarization. Entire industries, from advertising to social media algorithms, quietly rely on these mental tendencies. When people say the world feels more divided than ever, cognitive biases are often part of the explanation, but understanding them also offers a path forward. If there were a single practical rule to counteract confirmation bias, it might sound like this. Actively search for the strongest argument against your own belief. This sounds simple, but it is psychologically difficult. Our instincts push us toward agreement, not contradiction. Seeking opposing views can feel uncomfortable, even threatening. Yet this habit has remarkable effects. When individuals deliberately examine opposing evidence, they become less dogmatic and more accurate in their judgments. Conversations become less about winning and more about understanding. Complex issues reveal nuance instead of collapsing into slogans. In other words, intellectual humility begins to replace intellectual combat. Imagine if more citizens approached news, science, politics, and social issues with a simple internal question: what evidence would prove me wrong? The world would not suddenly become free of disagreement, but discussions would become more grounded in curiosity than certainty. And that small shift from defending beliefs to investigating them has the power to transform not only how we think, but how we live together. Because the first step toward clearer thinking is not proving others wrong. It is recognizing that the mind we trust most, our own, is quietly biased in ways we rarely see. Chapter 2: Limited Working Memory. If the human mind were a grand library filled with memories, knowledge, experiences, and ideas, working memory would be the small desk near the entrance, where only a few books can be opened at once. Everything else must wait on the shelves. This small desk, this narrow mental workspace, is where reasoning happens. It is where we compare ideas, solve problems, weigh evidence, and make decisions. But unlike the vast storage capacity of long-term memory, working memory is sharply limited. At any given moment, most people can actively hold only a handful of pieces of information in mind. Psychologists have studied this limitation for decades. While the exact number varies depending on the situation, the general principle remains the same. Our conscious thinking space is extremely small. This constraint shapes how humans understand the world. When situations become complex, when there are too many variables, too many statistics, too many perspectives, the mind begins to simplify. It compresses information into categories, slogans, rules of thumb, and emotional impressions. This is not laziness, it is a necessity. The brain cannot juggle everything at once. Consider a woman named Priya. Priya works long hours and tries to stay informed about current events. One evening, she opens a news article about climate policy. The article includes scientific projections, economic trade-offs, international agreements, technological solutions, and political debates across multiple countries. Within a few paragraphs, her working memory is already under strain. Each piece of information competes for attention. Carbon emission statistics, economic growth projections, energy infrastructure costs, international cooperation challenges, scientific uncertainty ranges. To fully evaluate the issue, Priya would need to hold many of these variables in mind simultaneously while comparing their relationships. But working memory simply cannot manage that level of complexity for long, so her brain begins to compress the problem. Maybe the story becomes governments need to act faster. Or perhaps the economic costs are too high. Or even scientists exaggerate these risks. The mind selects a manageable narrative, one that fits comfortably within the limits of working memory. From that point forward, the narrative becomes the lens through which new information is interpreted. Again, Priya is not unintelligent. In fact, she may be highly capable in her profession, but the complexity of global issues often exceeds what any individual mind can hold at once. The modern world places enormous demands on working memory. Previous generations faced difficult problems, but the average person was not expected to evaluate global supply chains, epidemiological models, economic policy, technological disruption, geopolitical conflict, and climate science, often all within the same week. Today, we encounter this information constantly. Social media feeds, news updates, podcasts, and discussions bombard us with intricate issues that require expert-level understanding, yet our mental workspace has not expanded to match this informational explosion. The result is predictable. People simplify. They reduce complicated systems into heroes and villains, quick solutions, or emotionally satisfying explanations. The more complex the problem becomes, the more appealing simple answers feel. This dynamic helps explain why slogans spread faster than nuanced analysis, and why certainty often sounds more convincing than careful doubt. If we were to turn this psychological limitation into a practical rule for better thinking, it might sound like this: respect complexity before forming certainty. This commandment encourages a pause, an acknowledgement that some issues are far larger than the mental workspace we naturally possess. When individuals recognize the limits of working memory, several things begin to change. First, humility increases. People become more cautious about declaring simple solutions to deeply complicated problems. Second, collaboration becomes more valuable. Complex systems often require multiple experts working together, each contributing pieces of understanding that no single mind could hold alone. Third, patience grows. Instead of rushing toward immediate conclusions, people allow ideas to develop gradually as new information emerges. Imagine how discussions about public policy, technology, economics, and science might evolve if more people adopted this mindset. Instead of demanding instant answers to complicated questions, societies might become more comfortable with thoughtful investigation. The world's problems would not suddenly disappear, but they would be approached with greater realism, because the challenge of modern civilization is not only gathering knowledge, it is learning how to think responsibly within the narrow doorway of the human mind. Chapter 3: Emotional Reasoning. Human beings like to think of themselves as rational creatures. We imagine that our beliefs are built carefully, like structures of logic rising brick by brick from evidence, but beneath that tidy picture lies a more complicated truth. Before the mind reasons, it feels. Emotions are not a minor feature of human thinking. They are one of its central engines. Fear, anger, pride, loyalty, embarrassment, hope. These forces move through the brain long before careful reasoning begins. They color the way we interpret information, shape what we pay attention to, and influence the conclusions we reach. One of the most common psychological patterns that emerges from this process is called emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning occurs when people treat their emotional reactions as evidence of truth. Instead of asking, "What do the facts show?" the mind quietly asks a different question. What does this situation feel like? If something feels threatening, we assume it probably is. If something feels unfair, we assume injustice has occurred. If something feels convincing, we assume it must be correct. In daily life, these shortcuts often operate unnoticed, yet they influence decisions in relationships, workplaces, politics, and public discourse. The danger is not that emotions exist. Emotions are essential signals that guide human survival and connection. The danger arises when emotions quietly replace investigation. Consider a father named Michael. One afternoon, Michael receives a message from his teenage daughter's school asking parents to attend an informational meeting about a new education policy. The message includes a few brief details but leaves many questions unanswered. Later that evening, Michael scrolls through social media and sees a post from another parent claiming the policy will damage children's futures and strip parents of control. The post is written in urgent language, filled with strong warnings and dramatic predictions. Michael feels a sudden surge of concern. His heart rate rises slightly. His mind imagines scenarios where his daughter might be negatively affected. The emotion arrives first: fear. Without realizing it, Michael's brain begins interpreting information through that emotional lens. When he reads supportive explanations of the policy, they seem vague and unconvincing. When he encounters criticism, it feels immediately persuasive. Within a short time, he becomes convinced that the policy is dangerous. By the time he attends the meeting, Michael is already angry. Throughout the presentation, he listens selectively. Neutral statements feel suspicious. Clarifications sound like excuses. His emotional state quietly guides which information feels trustworthy and which does not. After the meeting, he leaves believing the policy is deeply harmful, even though much of the information presented contradicted the fears he initially absorbed online. Michael did not intentionally ignore the facts, but his emotional response shaped the way those facts were processed. Neuroscience offers an important clue as to why this happens. The brain systems responsible for emotional responses evolved long before the systems responsible for complex reasoning. In many situations, emotional signals move faster than conscious analysis. When a potential threat appears, the brain's priority is speed. For our ancestors, hesitation in the face of danger could mean death. As a result, emotional alarm systems developed to respond quickly, sometimes before the rational mind had time to evaluate the situation. In the modern world, however, these ancient systems respond not only to physical threats, but also to social and informational ones. A controversial headline, a heated political argument, or a provocative social media post can trigger emotional reactions similar to those once reserved for survival situations. Once the emotional system activates, reasoning often becomes secondary. This is why arguments rarely change minds when emotions are already running high. When people feel attacked, frightened, or insulted, their primary goal shifts from understanding the issue to defending themselves or their group. If emotional reasoning is so deeply built into human psychology, how can individuals guard against its distortions? A practical commandment might be expressed this way: pause when emotion is strongest. Strong emotional reactions are often signals that the mind is about to simplify reality too quickly. Instead of immediately concluding, a pause creates space for reflection. This pause can take many forms: waiting before sharing or responding to emotionally charged information, asking additional questions before forming a firm opinion, separating the emotional reaction from the factual claim being made. These small habits can dramatically improve judgment. Imagine a culture where people treated emotional intensity as a cue for deeper thinking rather than immediate certainty. Social media arguments might slow down, public conversations could become less reactive, disagreements might remain passionate but grow more thoughtful. Emotions would still matter, they always will. They give life meaning, urgency, and connection, but they would no longer quietly take the place of evidence. In a world overflowing with fast reactions and instant conclusions, the simple act of pausing may be one of the most powerful forms of intelligence we possess. Because the goal of better thinking is not to eliminate emotion, it is to prevent emotion from quietly rewriting reality. Chapter 4: Social Conformity. Human beings often imagine themselves as independent thinkers. We like to believe that our opinions are the result of careful reflection and personal conviction. When we look at history and see crowds following harmful ideas or destructive movements, we comfort ourselves with a quiet assumption: I would not have gone along with that. But the psychology of social conformity tells a more humbling story. Humans are deeply social creatures. For most of our evolutionary history, survival depended not only on intelligence or strength, but on belonging. Being accepted by the group meant protection, cooperation, and shared resources. Being rejected could mean isolation, vulnerability, or death. As a result, the human brain developed powerful mechanisms that encourage agreement with the surrounding group. These mechanisms operate subtly. They influence tone of voice, body language, laughter, silence, and eventually their beliefs themselves. In many situations, people conform not because they believe the group is correct, but because the cost of disagreement feels too high. Psychologists have long demonstrated the strength of this effect. In classic experiments, individuals were placed in groups where several participants, secretly working with the researchers, gave obviously incorrect answers to simple visual questions. When asked which line matched a reference line, the correct answer was often unmistakable. Yet when multiple group members confidently chose the wrong option, a surprising number of participants followed the group and repeated the same incorrect answer. They could see the truth with their own eyes, but the pull of the crowd was stronger. Some participants later admitted they knew the answer was wrong but did not want to stand out. Others began to doubt their own perception entirely, assuming the group must see something they did not. This is the quiet power of social conformity. It can change both what we say and what we believe. Consider a young employee named Daniel starting his first job at a growing technology company. During his first few months, Daniel notices a small but troubling practice. His team occasionally presents optimistic projections to clients, numbers that appear slightly inflated compared to the internal data he has seen. At first, Daniel assumes he must be misunderstanding something. During meetings, senior colleagues confidently repeat the projections. The room nods in agreement. No one questions the numbers. The atmosphere suggests that this is simply how things are done. Daniel feels a quiet tension. Part of him wants to ask for clarification. Another part imagines how the question might sound. What if I look naive? What if I embarrass my manager? What if everyone else already understands something I don't? The moment passes. Over time, the practice becomes normal. Daniel adapts. He learns how the presentations are structured, how the language is framed, how optimism is subtly encouraged. Months later, a new employee joins the team and notices the same discrepancy Daniel once saw. She hesitates, just as he did, and the pattern continues. No one in the room necessarily intended to mislead clients, but the gravitational pull of group norms quietly guided everyone toward the same behavior. Moments like this occur in workplaces, communities, schools, and online spaces every day. Social conformity can reinforce positive behaviors, cooperation, generosity, shared responsibility, but it can also perpetuate mistakes, misinformation, and ethical compromises. The reason is simple. Standing apart from the group carries emotional risk. Disagreement can lead to awkward silence, social tension, or the fear of being excluded. Even mild disapproval activates areas of the brain associated with physical discomfort. Our nervous systems interpret social rejection as something genuinely painful. Because of this, many people learn to adjust their opinions slightly toward the group, often without realizing it. Over time, those small adjustments can accumulate, shaping cultures and institutions in powerful ways. If social conformity exerts such influence over human behavior, how can individuals preserve independent thought without abandoning the benefits of community? A practical commandment might be expressed as follows: respect the group, but question the consensus. This principle does not require constant disagreement or stubborn contrarianism. Groups are often correct, and cooperation is essential for any functioning society. But the commandment encourages a small but vital habit: the willingness to pause and ask whether agreement is based on evidence or simply momentum. In practical terms, this might mean asking thoughtful questions when something seems unclear, welcoming respectful disagreement in discussions, creating environments where uncertainty can be expressed without embarrassment. When even one person calmly raises a question, it often permits others to do the same. What appeared to be unanimous certainty may turn out to be a room full of people who had similar doubts but lacked the confidence to voice them. History contains many moments where a single dissenting voice changed the course of events, not because that person was necessarily more intelligent, but because they were willing to step briefly outside the comfort of agreement. Imagine a world in which questioning the consensus was not seen as disloyalty, but as a contribution to clarity. Organizations would detect problems earlier. Public conversations would contain more nuance. Ideas would be tested more thoroughly before spreading through society. Social belonging would remain one of humanity's greatest strengths, but it would no longer come at the cost of independent thought. Because progress rarely begins with a crowd. It begins with someone willing to say, calmly and respectfully, "Are we sure about this?" Chapter 5: Overconfidence Bias. Confidence is one of the most persuasive qualities a person can display. A confident voice commands attention. A confident leader attracts followers. A confident expert can influence decisions that affect thousands, or even millions of people. But confidence and accuracy are not the same thing. One of the most common psychological tendencies in human thinking is overconfidence bias, the tendency to overestimate the accuracy of our knowledge, judgments, and abilities. People routinely believe they understand situations more clearly than they actually do. They feel more certain about their predictions than the evidence justifies. This bias is not limited to the uninformed. In many cases, the more familiar people become with a subject, the easier it becomes to mistake familiarity for mastery. Partial knowledge can create a strong sense of certainty, even when deeper complexities remain hidden. The mind enjoys the feeling of knowing. Doubt feels uncomfortable. Uncertainty can create anxiety. Confidence, on the other hand, brings psychological relief. It creates a sense of control over a complicated world, so the brain often chooses confidence, even when caution would be wiser. Overconfidence appears in several subtle forms. People tend to believe their skills are above average, even when statistically that cannot be true for everyone. They often underestimate the likelihood of errors in their plans, while overestimating their ability to solve problems quickly. When making predictions, they frequently express far more certainty than the available evidence supports. These patterns appear in fields as diverse as medicine, finance, politics, business strategy, and everyday decision making. The danger is not that people feel confident. Confidence is often necessary to act in uncertain situations. The danger arises when confidence replaces careful evaluation. Consider a young investor named Sarah. After several years of saving money, Sarah begins learning about the stock market. She reads a few books, watches financial videos online, and studies recent trends in technology companies. Over the course of several months, she becomes increasingly comfortable with the language of investing. One day she notices a particular company receiving enormous attention. Articles describe it as revolutionary. Influential commentators discuss its growth potential. Online communities speak about the company with excitement and urgency. Sarah studies a few financial charts and reads several optimistic analyses. Everything appears to point in the same direction. rapid future success. She feels a growing sense of certainty. The information she has gathered forms a clear story in her mind. She believes she understands the company's trajectory and decides to invest a significant portion of her savings. For a while, the decision seems brilliant. The stock price rises quickly, reinforcing her confidence. Friends begin asking for her opinion on other investments. But months later, unexpected problems emerge within the company, issues that experienced analysts had warned about, but that Sarah had not fully understood at the time. The market shifts. The stock falls sharply. Looking back, Sarah realizes something important. She had mistaken early familiarity for deep understanding. Her confidence had grown faster than her knowledge. Part of the power of overconfidence lies in how persuasive confident people appear to others. In social environments, individuals who speak with certainty are often seen as more credible, even when their accuracy is no better, or sometimes worse, than those who speak with caution. In leadership and public discourse, this can create a troubling dynamic. Voices expressing strong certainty often dominate discussions, while more careful, nuanced perspectives struggle to gain attention. Yet reality rarely operates with absolute clarity. Most important decisions involve uncertainty, incomplete information, and unpredictable outcomes. True expertise often includes an awareness of these limits. Ironically, the more someone genuinely understands a complex subject, the more comfortable they become with acknowledging uncertainty. If overconfidence is such a natural feature of human thinking, how can individuals reduce its influence? A practical commandment might be stated simply: replace certainty with calibrated confidence. Calibrated confidence means aligning the strength of our beliefs with the strength of the evidence supporting them. Instead of speaking or thinking in absolute terms, always, never, certainly, people learn to recognize degrees of probability. This approach encourages habits such as asking, "How sure am I about this, really?" Considering alternative outcomes before making decisions, seeking feedback or expertise from others who may see the problem differently. These practices do not eliminate confidence. Instead, they transform confidence into something more reliable, confidence grounded in evidence rather than assumption. Imagine a world in which leaders, professionals, and citizens alike were comfortable acknowledging uncertainty. Decisions would still need to be made, but they would be approached with greater care. Predictions would be offered with humility rather than exaggeration. Public trust might even grow, because honesty about uncertainty often proves more credible than unwarranted certainty. Confidence would remain a powerful human trait, but it would be guided by a deeper awareness of the limits of what any one person can truly know. And in a complex world, that awareness may be one of the most valuable forms of wisdom we possess. Chapter 6: Information Overload. For most of human history, information was scarce. A farmer in the 18th century might hear local news from neighbors, read a few printed pamphlets, listen to stories passed through the community, and perhaps attend a town gathering where events were discussed. Knowledge moved slowly, opinions formed gradually. The pace of information matched the pace of human thought. Today, that balance has completely reversed. Modern individuals live inside an information storm. News updates arrive every hour. Social media feeds refresh endlessly. Articles, podcasts, videos, comments, expert opinions, and amateur interpretations flood the mind from every direction. At any given moment, a person can access more information than entire societies once encountered in a lifetime. This abundance may appear to be a triumph of progress. But the human brain did not evolve for such conditions. One of the most significant cognitive challenges of the modern age is information overload, the point at which the quantity of incoming information exceeds the brain's capacity to process it effectively. When this threshold is crossed, something surprising happens. Instead of becoming more informed, people often become less accurate in their thinking. The brain has a limited supply of attention and mental energy. Every article read, every notification checked, every debate considered consumes a small portion of that resource. When information arrives faster than it can be processed, the mind begins to compensate. Instead of carefully evaluating each claim, it starts relying on shortcuts, headlines instead of full articles, emotional tone instead of detailed evidence, familiar sources instead of unfamiliar ones. Complex issues become simplified into quick judgments that can be made within seconds. In other words, the mind begins to triage information, deciding rapidly what seems important enough to consider and what can be ignored. This process is necessary for survival in a world overflowing with data, but it also creates a vulnerability. Decisions about truth may be made before deeper understanding has a chance to develop. Consider a nurse named Elena who finishes a long shift at a busy hospital. When she arrives home, she opens her phone to relax. Within minutes, she encounters dozens of headlines, political developments, economic predictions, scientific discoveries, global conflicts, health advice, celebrity controversies, and viral social media debates. Each headline demands attention. Some are alarming, some are inspiring, some appear urgent. Each one offers a fragment of information competing for space in her mind. Elena clicks one article about a new health study. Before she finishes reading it, a notification appears about another breaking story. A friend sends a link to a controversial opinion piece. A video discussing the same topic appears on her feed, followed by comments from hundreds of strangers arguing about its meaning. Within half an hour, Elena has absorbed fragments of 5 different stories, but has not fully understood any of them. Yet her brain begins to form impressions anyway. She starts feeling that certain issues are extremely important, others suspicious, and still others frustrating or confusing. These impressions arise not from deep analysis, but from the emotional tone and repetition of the information she has encountered. By the end of the evening, Elena feels strangely exhausted. Despite consuming a large amount of information, she does not feel particularly informed. She simply feels overwhelmed. Information overload is not entirely accidental. In many cases, modern digital systems are designed to compete aggressively for human attention. News outlets, social platforms, and content creators all operate within an attention economy, where capturing a few seconds of a person's focus can translate into influence, engagement, or revenue. As a result, information is often presented in ways that maximize emotional reaction, dramatic headlines, urgent language, simplified narratives. These techniques are effective at capturing attention, but they can also intensify the sense of overload. When every story appears urgent and every headline demands immediate reaction, the mind struggles to determine what truly deserves careful thought. If information overload is an unavoidable feature of the modern world, how can individuals maintain clarity in their thinking? A useful commandment might be expressed this way: consume information deliberately, not continuously. This principle encourages a shift from constant exposure to intentional engagement. Instead of absorbing every headline that appears, individuals can choose smaller amounts of information and explore them more deeply. Rather than reacting instantly to every update, they can allow time for context and reflection. In practical terms, this might involve setting specific times to read or watch the news rather than checking continuously. Focusing on a few reliable sources instead of dozens of fragmented ones. Taking time to read full explanations instead of relying solely on summaries or headlines. These habits help transform information from noise into understanding. Imagine a culture where people value depth over speed in their consumption of information. Public discussions might become less reactive and more thoughtful. Complex issues could receive the sustained attention they require, rather than being reduced to fleeting trends. The modern world will never return to the slow information environment of the past, nor should it. The vast availability of knowledge is one of humanity's greatest achievements. But without discipline, in how we engage with that knowledge, abundance can easily become chaos. Clarity in an age of overload is no longer achieved by finding more information. It is achieved by choosing carefully which information deserves our attention. Chapter 7. Motivated Reasoning. Human beings often imagine that their minds operate like impartial judges. Evidence is presented, arguments are weighed, and conclusions are reached through calm and careful reasoning. But in many situations, the mind behaves less like a judge and more like a defense lawyer. Instead of asking, "What is true?" the brain quietly asks a different question. How can I defend what I already believe? This process is known as motivated reasoning. Motivated reasoning occurs when our desires, identities, loyalties, or emotional investments influence how we interpret information. Rather than evaluating evidence neutrally, the mind selectively accepts supportive information while scrutinizing or dismissing contradictory evidence. Unlike deliberate dishonesty, motivated reasoning usually happens without conscious awareness. People genuinely believe they are thinking objectively, even as their reasoning quietly bends toward conclusions that feel more comfortable or protective. In this way, beliefs can begin to defend themselves. Beliefs are not just ideas. Over time, they become woven into a person's sense of identity. Political beliefs may connect to family traditions. Religious beliefs may connect to community belonging. Professional beliefs may connect to years of education and reputation. Even small, everyday opinions can become attached to personal pride. When evidence challenges one of these beliefs, the brain may interpret the challenge not merely as an intellectual disagreement, but as a threat. Threats trigger defensive responses. The mind begins searching for reasons why the new evidence must be flawed. Perhaps the study was biased, the journalist unreliable, the critic misinformed, or the data incomplete. These explanations can sometimes be legitimate, but under motivated reasoning, they appear with unusual speed and certainty. Meanwhile, evidence supporting the original belief is accepted with far less scrutiny. The result is a subtle imbalance. Both sides of an argument are not evaluated equally. Consider a city council member named Thomas. For several years, Thomas has supported a large development project intended to bring jobs and economic growth to his community. He has spoken publicly about its benefits and helped secure funding approvals. The project has become closely associated with his reputation as a leader. At first, everything appears promising, but over time, independent reports begin to surface, suggesting that the environmental impact may be greater than originally predicted. Some economists also question whether the projected job numbers were overly optimistic. When Thomas reads the reports, he feels a wave of discomfort. If the criticisms are correct, it could mean the project carries serious consequences, and that he played a role in approving it. The thought threatens not only his policy decision, but also his self-image as a responsible public servant. Without consciously deciding to do so, Thomas begins interpreting the new information defensively. He notices small weaknesses in the reports and focuses on them intensely. Perhaps the researchers used incomplete data. Perhaps they have political motives. Perhaps the situation is more complicated than the critics suggest. At the same time, he continues giving strong weight to earlier studies that supported the project, even though some of those studies were conducted before new environmental data became available. Gradually, Thomas becomes convinced that the criticisms are exaggerated. He is not intentionally ignoring the evidence. In his mind, he has evaluated the situation carefully. But motivated reasoning has quietly guided the process. Motivated reasoning does not only affect individuals, it can influence entire groups. When people share identities, political affiliations, professional communities, cultural backgrounds, they often adopt similar beliefs about important issues. Within these groups, information that supports shared beliefs spreads easily and is trusted quickly. Information that challenges the group's perspective, however, may be treated with suspicion or hostility. Over time, this dynamic can create intellectual echo chambers, where members of each group become increasingly confident in their own conclusions while growing more skeptical of outside perspectives. In such environments, debates become less about discovering truth and more about defending identity. If motivated reasoning is rooted in the human need for belonging and self-protection, eliminating it may be impossible, but it can be weakened. A practical commandment might be expressed as follows: treat challenges to your beliefs as opportunities, not threats. This mindset transforms disagreement from something personal into something productive. When individuals encounter information that contradicts their beliefs, they can pause and ask a simple question: if this were true, what would it teach me? This question shifts the mind from defense to curiosity. Instead of immediately rejecting the information, the individual explores it, examining its evidence, considering its implications, and allowing the possibility that their understanding may need adjustment. This approach does not require abandoning deeply held beliefs at the first sign of disagreement. It simply encourages a willingness to examine new information with the same openness we apply to information that supports our views. Imagine a society in which people approached conflicting ideas with curiosity rather than reflexive defense. Public conversations would become less hostile. Complex problems could be discussed without every disagreement turning into a battle for identity. Beliefs would still matter, values would still guide decisions, but truth would no longer have to fight so hard to be heard. Because the most powerful antidote to motivated reasoning is not greater intelligence. It is the courage to let our beliefs evolve when reality asks them to. Chapter 8: Cognitive Laziness. The human brain is one of the most powerful organs in nature. It can compose symphonies, solve complex mathematical problems, design spacecraft, and imagine entire civilizations that do not yet exist. But despite this extraordinary capability, the brain has a strong preference for something very simple: efficiency. Thinking deeply is surprisingly expensive. The brain consumes a significant amount of the body's energy, and complex reasoning requires even more. Careful analysis demands attention, concentration, and mental effort. It slows us down. So the brain develops a habit that psychologists sometimes refer to as cognitive laziness. The tendency to rely on quick, automatic thinking rather than deliberate, effortful reasoning whenever possible. This does not mean people are literally lazy or unwilling to think. Instead, it means the mind naturally prefers fast thinking over slow thinking. When an answer appears quickly and feels plausible, the brain often accepts it without further examination. Most of the time, this shortcut works reasonably well. Everyday decisions, choosing what to eat, navigating familiar streets, responding to casual conversations, do not require deep analysis. But when complex or important issues arise, this preference for mental ease can lead to serious misunderstandings. Psychologists often describe human thinking as operating in two general modes. The first is fast thinking. It is automatic, intuitive, and effortless. Fast thinking helps us recognize faces, understand language, and make quick judgments. It operates constantly and usually without conscious awareness. The second is slow thinking. This mode is deliberate and analytical. It activates when we solve difficult problems, evaluate evidence, or question our initial impressions. Slow thinking requires concentration and energy. The challenge is that fast thinking tends to dominate. Once it produces an answer that feels reasonable, the brain often sees no need to engage the slower system. The result is a mind that can appear confident even when it has not examined the situation very carefully. Consider a warehouse supervisor named Marcus. One afternoon, Marcus hears from a colleague that a new workplace safety regulation will soon be introduced. The colleague mentions that the rule might slow down operations and increase paperwork. Later that evening, Marcus sees a short social media post criticizing the same regulation. The post claims the rule is unnecessary and will only create obstacles for hard-working employees. The message is simple and emotionally appealing. Marcus reads it quickly while scrolling through his phone. The explanation fits neatly with what he has already heard and with his general frustration about administrative changes at work. Within seconds, he forms a firm opinion. The new regulation must be pointless. He shares the post with several co-workers and adds a comment about how common sense seems to be disappearing. What Marcus does not do, largely because the situation does not feel important enough to justify the effort, is examine the regulation more carefully. He does not read the full policy explanation or the accident reports that originally motivated the change. If he had taken the time, he might have discovered that the rule was created after a series of serious workplace injuries in similar facilities. The additional procedures were designed to prevent accidents that had previously caused long-term harm to employees. Marcus is not an irresponsible person. He cares about safety and about his colleagues. But his brain accepted the first explanation that felt plausible, and fast thinking closed the case before slow thinking had a chance to begin. Cognitive laziness thrives in environments where information moves quickly and attention is constantly divided. Modern life presents a steady stream of claims, opinions, headlines, and debates. Each piece of information demands some degree of evaluation. If the brain examined every claim carefully, the mental workload would become overwhelming. So it begins sorting information rapidly. If the idea sounds familiar, it is probably true. If the explanation is simple, it is probably correct. If the message comes from someone we trust, it probably does not require further checking. These shortcuts save time and energy, but they also create opportunities for misunderstanding, manipulation, and the spread of incomplete or misleading information. If cognitive laziness is a natural tendency of the human mind, the goal cannot be to eliminate it. Quick thinking is essential for daily life, but we can learn to recognize moments when deeper thinking is necessary. A practical commandment might be expressed this way: when something feels obvious, think twice. This principle encourages a brief pause whenever a conclusion appears too easy. Instead of immediately accepting the first explanation that comes to mind, the individual asks a few additional questions. Is there more to this issue than the quick summary suggests? What information might be missing from this explanation? Would my opinion change if I examined the full context? These questions activate the slower, more careful system of thought. Imagine a culture where people regularly took a few extra moments to examine claims before reacting to them. Discussions might slow down, but they would also become more thoughtful. Misunderstandings could be corrected earlier. Decisions would be shaped less by quick impressions and more by genuine understanding. The human brain will always prefer the path of least resistance, but wisdom often begins when we choose, occasionally and deliberately, to think a little harder than our instincts suggest. Chapter 9: Uneven Intelligence Distribution. When people talk about intelligence, they often speak as if it were a single trait, something a person either possesses in abundance or lacks entirely. In everyday conversation, someone may be described simply as smart or not very bright, as though the mind operates like a single dial that can be turned up or down. But human intelligence does not work that way. In reality, intelligence is unevenly distributed across different domains. A person may display extraordinary ability in one area while struggling in another. Someone might excel at mathematics, yet find social situations confusing. Another person might read emotions and relationships with remarkable sensitivity, but struggle with abstract reasoning or technical details. The human mind is less like a single engine and more like a collection of specialized tools. This uneven distribution often leads to misunderstanding. When we encounter someone performing poorly in a domain that feels obvious to us, we may assume they lack intelligence entirely. Yet the same person may possess strengths in areas we rarely notice or value. The mistake lies not in recognizing differences in ability, but in assuming that intelligence must be uniform across all aspects of life. Modern research in psychology and neuroscience suggests that cognitive abilities involve multiple systems working together. These systems support different skills: language, spatial reasoning, logical analysis, creativity, emotional awareness, physical coordination, and many others. Because these abilities develop through a combination of biology, education, environment, and personal interest, they rarely grow in perfect balance. A brilliant engineer might struggle to communicate ideas clearly to others. A gifted artist might find financial planning confusing. A skilled negotiator might feel lost when confronted with complex statistics. Each person carries a unique pattern of strengths and weaknesses, a patchwork of intelligence rather than a perfectly symmetrical design. Consider two colleagues working in the same company, David and Sophia. David is a software developer with an extraordinary ability to understand complex technical systems. He can examine thousands of lines of code and identify subtle errors that others overlook. When new software tools appear, he learns them quickly and begins experimenting with advanced features almost immediately. In technical meetings, David is often the most knowledgeable person in the room, but outside those discussions, he sometimes struggles. During team planning sessions, he finds it difficult to follow shifting conversations about schedules, budgets, and interpersonal concerns. When colleagues hint at subtle frustrations or unspoken expectations, he often misses the signals entirely. Sophia, on the other hand, works in project management. She does not write code and rarely understands the technical details of David's work. When developers begin discussing programming frameworks, she listens politely but feels lost within minutes. Yet Sophia possesses a different set of abilities. She notices tensions within the team before they escalate into conflict. She understands how different personalities respond to pressure and adjusts her communication accordingly. When disagreements arise, she helps people find common ground and keeps projects moving forward. One afternoon, the company faces a serious challenge. A major software update must be completed quickly, but the team is exhausted and communication has begun to break down. David identifies a critical bug that could have delayed the entire release. His technical insight saves the project from failure. Sophia then organizes the team, redistributes responsibilities, and mediates several disagreements that might otherwise have halted progress. By the end of the week, the project succeeds, not because one person was universally intelligent, but because different forms of intelligence worked together. Despite the obvious value of diverse abilities, societies often reward only certain forms of intelligence while overlooking others. Academic achievement, technical expertise, and analytical reasoning are frequently treated as the primary measures of intelligence. These abilities are undeniably important. They drive scientific discovery, technological innovation, and complex problem solving. But other forms of intelligence, emotional awareness, practical judgment, creative insight, social understanding, are just as essential for functioning communities. When these different abilities are not recognized, misunderstandings arise. People begin to underestimate those whose talents lie outside the narrow definitions they are accustomed to valuing. The result can be unnecessary division, resentment, and wasted potential. If intelligence truly exists in many forms, the question becomes how societies and individuals should respond to this reality. A practical commandment might be expressed in these words: respect the intelligence you do not personally possess. This principle encourages humility and curiosity. When someone demonstrates skill in an area we do not understand, the natural response becomes exploration rather than dismissal. Instead of thinking, that person isn't very smart, we begin asking a different question. What kind of intelligence might this person have that I do not? This shift in perspective can transform relationships and institutions. In workplaces, teams become more effective when different strengths are recognized and combined. In education, students develop confidence when their unique abilities are valued rather than compared against a single standard. In everyday life, people learn to appreciate perspectives that differ from their own. Imagine a society where intelligence was understood as a complex landscape rather than a simple hierarchy. Conversations would become less about proving superiority and more about sharing different forms of insight. The world's problems are rarely solved by one kind of mind alone. They are solved when many different minds, each with their own uneven pattern of strengths, learn how to think together.